Hello, everybody. We're here with Kylo Ren's taller, more evil brother, qwertymodo. What's up, man?
Hey, not much. How's it going?
Pretty good. So, for anybody that heard our interview last time, it was a nightmare and it was my fault. I used the wrong compressor on his voice, and he sounded like Kylo Ren or Bane from Batman or whatever you would like to say. So, yeah, well, welcome back, and this time is going to be way, way better for audio.
Yeah, well, I figured I would come prepared just in case.
Yeah.
But all right.
I'm gonna take this off because I can't see anything without my glasses.
So, I haven't done interviews in consistently in a while, only because it just my schedule's been nuts, and I really want to get back into it because I miss doing these. And you were the first person that I contacted because I felt like well, two reasons. I felt like I owed you one for screwing up your voice by accident last time, and you know when you go through Skype, it's so hard to do these things because at the moment OBS isn't able to record two different channels. So, like,
Yeah.
it would a perfect world, I would record me as left, you as right, and then if there was an issue with volumes, no problem. Just hit the mixer afterwards and export as mono. But I couldn't do it. That was just the best that you could get in that situation. So the other reason I wanted you back is because I knew who you were. I knew your work last time. I'd followed you. Everything I said was true. I just didn't know the extent of your work. So, like, I knew of everything that you did on Zeldix. I didn't realize that was your website. So,
I'm the owner of it now, but it was transferred to me from Seth, who was one of the original guys who worked on Parallel Worlds. The
mhm.
site was originally created as a private forum, basically for the two of them and a couple other folks to collaborate on that project,
Mhm.
so that they could have a place to document stuff and work. And after Seth went on and did Conker's Hyrule Tale, uh, that was kind of the end of what he needed it for, and he was paying for it, and he didn't really want to keep it up, so he was looking for somebody to kind of take the reins. So
Ah,
I'm running it now, but it wasn't necessarily mine to begin with.
okay. So I think we should just go back to the beginning for if anybody didn't hear the first one or stopped the first interview because it was too bad quality. So you are Ben, aka qwertymodo,
Yep.
and you have been working on everything from MSU on audio hacks to a board that a newer, easier way to get the correct clock speed out of a Super Game Boy. That's been around forever, but it started out as a wad of wires and awfulness and everything else.
Yeah.
So I guess go back to the beginning, if you will, and what got you into all this stuff.
Oh man. Well, really, what started it all was I wanted to build myself a repro of Parallel Worlds. Like, I hadn't done any hardware stuff. I hadn't done any assembly language stuff. Uh, I was going to school just for software, so I'd done a lot of C and C++ and some Java and some of that stuff, but I really hadn't done anything in the SNES stuff. And really, what started my interest in all of this was wanting to build a repro of Parallel Worlds. And so
So Parallel Worlds
from
was Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past that was completely and totally redone as a new game that most casual players would call impossibly and maddeningly yeah, it enrages people. I don't know why I can't say that word
yes,
today. Maybe I haven't drank enough yet, but yeah. So that's something that I tried when it first came out through emulation, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get more than an hour and a half into it. So at this point, you just
mhm.
wanted to make a repro of it for yourself, for use on
yeah,
original hardware.
because because I wanted to play it on an original hardware. At that point, I didn't have a flash card or anything, and I was looking around at how much people were charging for repros and like how terrible the quality was. Like if you think back 5 or 6 years at before
Hmm.
things like Voltar Super Stacker were
Right.
even a possibility. You had people pulling out these old bit rotting EPROMs and like soldering them in with wires, even on the dip parts. Like, it was
Yeah.
30 wires for a 20 pin part, and it was awful. And I was looking at it, I was like, this is garbage. And not only is it garbage, they're charging so much for it. I could do this.
Mm.
And that kind of just got me started down the whole path. It even led to me picking up a second major. I actually ended up finding that I enjoyed the electronic side of things and went into hardware. So I'm doing hardware and software degrees. So
that's really cool. So do you have an electrical engineering degree, or do you?
not electrical engineering. That got a little bit more in depth than I really wanted to go. So it's actually a computer engineering, which is kind of we kind of touch on the hardware, like the physical circuit building and stuff like that, and then also did like some HDL stuff. I only ended up going for the associates in that because I've been working full time and putting myself through school and trying to do that and do 2 degrees. I got to the point where I was like, I would like to actually graduate and get out of here instead of being here another 8 years. But yeah, so I did a lot of that stuff and I enjoyed it.
So that background makes a lot of sense on how you're able to do such wildly different projects. Then that makes more sense now. I mean, not that people can't do that. It's just rare that you see people go through the whole range of stuff. But yeah, that's cool that you tie that into both work and fun. So yeah,
the downside is that I start 50 projects and then never finish any of them.
Yeah, well, that's very common, and in fact, it's just common period in life that so many people do that, especially in the retro gaming world. I try not to talk about stuff anymore unless it's like unless it's a sure thing or as close to a sure thing as humanly possible or anything. So yeah. It's I know the feeling. Yeah. So what did you actually end up doing to make that original repro?
So I used the TSOP 48. I think it's the M29F flash chip, and I actually learned how to use Eagle. I learned how to design all of the parts and boards and stuff, and made my own little dip to TSOP adapter, and I used that.
Oh, cool. That's pretty neat. Yeah. So what made you want to start the work that you did on Parallel Worlds? Did you just make your own repro of it, start playing it, and go, this is too crazy? Or
now I'm trying to remember back to this was a while ago, trying to actually remember how things went. So I think what started out was that I got involved over at Zeldix, and then Khan, the guy who wrote the original MSU1 Zelda hack, at least the original one that was ever released. There were a couple of people who kind of teased them and then never released. But so Khan was making a whole bunch of like small individual patches for little quality of life things. He took, for example, the Pegasus Boots from Ancient Stone tablets, where you can actually turn while you're running, and he ported that code over to the original Link to the Past. He did some item upgrades. He made it so that when you don't have a sword, you can punch and stun enemies, kind of like with the boomerang. And I took a bunch of these patches that he had just he'd just taken and made them all separate and combined them all and just put them into the vanilla game, just kind of as a quality of life update to the original game. And I called it Link to the Past DX. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my go-to version when I play it now, by the way. It still is.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I also put the MSU1 in there. So, yeah, so it's kind of like everything that looked like it was useful in the original game without completely changing the original game. I wanted it to feel like the original game with just the quality of life stuff. And then after playing that a bunch, I went and was playing Parallel Worlds and realized that I kind of wished I had those same quality of life improvements in Parallel Worlds. So I started by just porting those over, and then realized that there was other stuff that I could do. And I just started digging into it and started doing bug fixes. And it just kind of turned into a really huge project that eventually became Parallel Worlds 1.2. And there's some new bugs in 1.2 that I really need to go back and fix and put out a 1.3, but that's one of those projects that, like I said, I pick up 50 projects and then never finish them. So,
but they're not game-breaking bugs, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. There's a couple of really weird overworld tiles up near the Sky Isles, where I was trying to fix another overworld area and accidentally overwrote. I thought I had checked everywhere to make sure that those tiles weren't actually used, and it turns out they were. So I wasn't very careful with that. I don't think they're game breaking. Somebody else put out a patch that they called 1.3, and that one does have some game breaking bugs in it. I don't know who put it out. I don't know what changes they made, but like they broke some entrances where you walk into a room and the game just soft locks.
Okay, so anybody that wants to play Parallel Worlds, stick with version 1.2. And isn't it the full title Parallel Worlds Remodeled version 1.2?
Okay, no, Remodeled is actually a different thing by Puzzle Dude, where he actually changed the dungeons to make them a little bit simpler. And actually, Puzzle Dude also put out a version that he called 1.23, and I think that's the version I would actually suggest. He reverted I think he reverted the overworld thing and a couple of other things. So
for people that want to play Parallel Worlds, there's Parallel Worlds version 1.23, which is Puzzle Dude's version of your 1.2 with some fixes. And then there's also Parallel Worlds Remodeled, which is Parallel Worlds with slightly easier dungeons.
Yep.
So is 1.2, I remember the last time we talked, I think you said it was something like a 20-hour game for the Parallel Worlds, for especially somebody just playing it for the first time?
Somebody playing for the first time, it might take you longer than that, just depending on how many times you die. I think it took me about 20 hours when I was doing my playtest run through. And I tried to basically 100% the game, and that took me about 20 hours with my knowledge of kind of where everything was. Wow. So if you don't, yeah,
that's a much larger game.
I think that's how long it took. I don't remember. This was several years ago, so maybe it took me more like 10. I don't remember. I would have to go back and look at my YouTube channel to actually see the length.
Because I think the longest I've ever gone without actually playing through A Link to the Past, the original game, I think it was like 6 years or something before, between completing it. And I think it had taken me like 15 hours to do that. And then maybe a year and a half after that, I went back with, when I got my Sony PVM and BVM monitors, I said, all right, now, I got to experience the game again. And then it took me 8. So it was almost double the time when I had forgotten most things about it. So, yeah, I guess it could be a much, much bigger or a much longer game for people that want to experience it. It's...
That and the Parallel Tower dungeon itself is just huge. And it's really long, and there's a lot of bosses, and you'll probably die a lot of times, and you have to do it multiple times. And that's a huge amount of the time in the game, is just the Parallel Tower itself.
Is it like a death run where you have to do it all, without dying in order to get through all the bosses?
I think so. That was one of the changes that I was trying to make, was trying to make it so that some of the bosses didn't respawn every time, because most of the bosses in that tower were set to respawn every time you enter the room. And so, yeah, it was pretty brutal.
Yeah, there was a few games that I played over the years that I never beat, even though I got all the way to the end, just because it was these grueling death runs of, you have to, the boss respawns in 3 different forms, and you have to learn and memorize all the controls and the moves of the first one, and then they change to a different form, and you have to keep practicing through all those, so you end up spending 3 or 4 hours on one little segment to get through them all, and I don't have time anymore for that. So, yeah, if I had played this up till now, I probably would have given up at the tower point.
And what's even worse is the Cane of Burna becomes basically almost a required item, but it's in the light world in a really hard to find place, and you can actually miss it, end up getting transported to the icy world, and then you can't go back and get it until you've basically beaten everything.
Oh,
and so that's something that I didn't manage to get into 1.2, but that's one of my plans for 1.3. And I think Puzzle Dude might have done it for 1.23. He put it somewhere different than what I was planning to do, but to basically put it in both places where you could get it in the light world or the icy world, depending on which one you get to first. So
in Remodeled, is that, the dungeons are a little bit easier, and the cane fix, but are there other things about it that make it
Well, the
easier?
cane, I think the cane fix is also in Parallel Worlds 1.23. I
Okay.
think. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't actually played through 1.23. I'm just trying to remember where he posted on Zeldix about what he was doing. So
If I ever get a vacation, maybe that'll be maybe that'll be my thing. Is I just spend a few hours a day and go through the original Parallel Worlds and enjoy it. Um, so for people that want a more traditional Zelda experience, and especially if you haven't played A Link to the Past in a long time, I'd absolutely always gush over the DX version because you do have some enhancements like you could turn while running. And could you talk a little bit more about what you added to that for just the DX? We'll talk about the MSU one in a second.
give me a second. It's been several years since I've done anything with that. Let me actually pull it up on my computer, and I can actually list off what's in that one.
So for
It
people
is.
listening while you're looking this up, basically it's the same game. So there's no major changes. There's nothing that would take away from the original, at least in my opinion. And although the turning with the Pegasus boots, I do feel like that makes the game flow a little bit faster. It doesn't make anything in the game easier. It's not like you could skip stuff because of it. So you're certainly not
Yeah.
cheating through it. I really do agree with the quality of life nomenclature for it. It's the same game, just a little bit better.
Yeah, okay. So I've got it pulled up. I would say the Pegasus boots are probably the most controversial issue. That's the one that people kind of complain about the most.
Really?
Yeah. Uh, some people just don't like it. But okay, so what I've got here is you can break pots with your sword, which is something you can do in like all the other Zelda games, but
Hmm.
for some reason you can't do it in this one. Um, that one actually causes there's a couple of dash bonks that you can't do as a result, but they're not required, or they're not like really useful for the most part. So I'm
It doesn't
I'm not
prevent you
too
from
worried
getting an
about those.
item or going past a
Yeah,
place in the game.
because usually you can bonk off of a pot and it'll throw you back, and you can use that to jump across a gap.
Hmm.
But now that you can break the pots with your sword, now you dash into them and you end up breaking them instead. Um, you can also collect items with your sword, which is another thing you can do in a lot of newer games. You just swing your sword, and it acts kind of like the boomerang, where any items that it contacts, it'll pick them up. Let's see. You can it. I changed how the death counter works, so it's actually just a death counter, and it doesn't count like saving quits in the when you get to the end of the game, and it tells you how many games you played. I
Right.
uh yeah,
So
so
that
it's
that is
only
legitimately now just how many times you've died, not how many times that you ran out of time and just hit save and quit. So
yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't
and
even
then
realize that was a thing in the original one, to be honest with you.
yeah, I didn't either until I saw that Con had made a patch for it, and then I realized that, oh yeah, that's something I would like, because that that makes more sense to me. You can switch your items with L and R. So
Oh,
if you press L or R, it'll actually just cycle through your Y button item. Um, it's converted to fast ROM, so that reduces some slowdown.
could you
And
explain a little
then
bit about how that works? Because I think a lot of people listening might have just perked up when you said that. Because I only know the basics around that. So
So for the most part, it's not going to make the game run faster when it's running properly. So it's not going to feel like you're playing the game in fast forward.
mhm.
But uh, basically, what happens is that in some places, so many things are happening on screen that you get lag,
Mhm.
and the game starts to slow down. Things like using bombos or certain bosses when there's a lot of sprites on screen. The Cane of Samaria is a really big one, or not Cane of, the Cane of Burna. Anytime you use the Cane of Burna, it just lags like crazy because all the little sparkle sprites that it's spawning that spin around you, and then trying to calculate the circular motion of those sparkles. So Fast ROM, the original game was created using a slow ROM chip, which means that I don't remember the exact numbers, so I won't try and come up with those numbers off the top of my head. But basically, there's a flag in the game header that tells the game, "Hey, we're using a slow ROM chip. So you need to slow down when you're trying to read data from the ROM. And so it actually does. It actually reads the data slower. So converting to fast ROM, basically you change that bit in the header, and then you have to change a whole bunch of other things as well in some of the addresses that you're jumping to. And basically you jump to a fast ROM address instead of jumping to the slow ROM address. And in doing so, basically you tell the CPU, okay, this is actually a fast ROM that can support being accessed at this higher speed, so you can go ahead and run at the higher speed. It's not nearly as much of a speed up as something like, say, the SA1 hacks for things like Gradius, but it definitely does help by something like, I want to say like 30% or something like that.
Oh, wow. And running it through something like
much.
the SD to SNES or SD to SNES Pro would, or even making your own repro with the faster ROM would be able to take advantage of that.
Yes, correct. And pretty much any flash ROM should be able to do it. I believe for like an EEPROM or something, you need to make sure that it's able to run at, I think it's 120 nanosecond access time. Some of the older EEPROMs might not be able to do that if you're using old EEPROMs for that. But yeah, the SD to SNES can definitely do it. And there's still other bottlenecks in the game. Some of the game code isn't as efficient as it could be, and sometimes it's just trying to do too much. So it's not going to fix everything, but it's just one thing that's fairly straightforward to add to the game code to try and improve things.
Now, do you think an SA1 patch for this is possible or even useful?
I think it's absolutely possible because Link to the Past doesn't use any other special chips. The question is, I don't know how useful it would be, and I don't see why you couldn't do it though.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe I'll ping Vitor after this and see if he's interested in seeing what it would do. I'll ask him to take the DX version, of course, but I'm always interested and fascinated by people that take things that are still designed to be run on original hardware and make those experiences better. And that's what I love about all this stuff is even if you choose not to use the SD to SNES and you pick up like a cheap, like I think there's one golf game that uses an SA1 chip, and you could use like the Super Stacker or something. And I believe the Real Phoenix just came out with another adapter as well to help for things like this. So that's
the
pretty
Super
killer.
Stacker wouldn't work on that cart, but yeah, the Real Phoenix made a board that would do it. I'm working on a board right now that would do it. Yeah, it would. You can definitely do a lot of really cool stuff with the original hardware.
And you also did did you do an MSU1 hack for that, or were you just helping Con with that?
For what?
Zelda, for Zelda DX, because I know Con put out the original orchestral Zelda soundtrack, and then somebody put out the soundtrack from A Link Between Worlds. And
That was me. Yeah.
that was you, okay, and you ported that to it. I like both. I don't know. Out of all three, original, orchestral, and that one, I'm really not sure which I like better. And
I think there might be like 6 or 7 for Link to the Past at this point. I've done at least 2 or 3. I did a metal guitar
I saw
soundtrack
that.
for it.
Yeah.
That sounds really awesome. There's one by a guy named the Synergist.
Mm-hmm.
I believe he's the one who did the Link to the Past Demastered, where he did a cover of the whole OST that sounds like Gameboy soundtrack.
Yeah, that's pretty killer. I liked all those. I think for me, it was always the orchestral I liked with the Ancient Stone Tablets, the very last release where you still play in real time and everything with the voiceovers and all that. It was still incredible to me. And I don't really know which one I had. I don't know if I have a favorite for the original Link to the Past. Because that soundtrack is amazing as is. So it's kind of hard, but the good thing about these is the save games work with all of them. So if you want to switch between them, just rename the save game, and you could play your game throughout many different soundtracks if you'd like. Well, if you're using obviously an SD to SNES, certainly not with a homemade repro. But
Yeah.
now there was also a version floating around that had some like cartoony intro in the beginning. Do you remember
Mhm.
where that came from? Because I don't know if I put together a version of DX or if I just found one that had the orchestral soundtrack and that, but it looked like the cartoon, but it wasn't the cartoon, right?
Yeah, I don't remember where that FMV was actually sourced from. I know Khan was the one who did the code for it, but I don't know where he got the original source video.
I remember looking this up at one point because so many of us were curious. I don't remember what I found. It wasn't part of the CDI version. It was something,
No,
but yeah, I don't know. That's
the
cool though.
animation was a lot better than the CDI version.
Yes, absolutely. If Yahel from Wrestling with Gaming is listening to this, he's going to be very angry, swearing at wherever he's listening at the moment, but unfortunately, that's correct. But that is my favorite to show people. Whenever I want to show off what could be done, I take out the SD to SNES, I put out that version, and then there's the cartoon intro, and then the DX version with the orchestral soundtrack, and it blows people away. Even people that were, as long as you had experienced the SNES in its original form at one point, you get blown away by this. It's obviously, if you've never seen a SNES before and you're used to modern games, I imagine that wouldn't be impressive. But anybody at any skill level, at any and any love for this stuff, comparing it to the original, they all freak out. So it's awesome that we have the ability to do this these days.
Yeah.
So onto onto some of the more recent projects. The one that kind of blew up in a good way for you was the clock mod for Super Game Boy, which is something that's been
Yeah.
out, but I don't think there's been very many elegant solutions for it. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
No. Sure. Yeah, it's definitely something that I had seen floating around, and everyone that I saw was uh, pretty pretty rough to put it nicely. For one thing, you had to actually lift pins off of the CPU. It's a surface mount chip, and you had to lift up two of the pins, and there are two pins that are sitting right next to each other. And then after you lift them, you actually had to solder wires to those two pins that are right next to each other. And most people would then run really long wires, which is not what you want to do with a clock crystal.
No.
Uh, and then they would just like put a clock crystal on a little piece of perf board and then hot glue it in the board inside the case, and it just didn't look very good. And then I learned about the Super Game Boy Commander controller, which has a couple of really cool features. And
Yeah,
one of those
that's the one from Hori, right? Where it's actually
yeah, I think they're the one. Well, I think Hori actually developed the Super Game Boy too. Like if you there's a hidden credits that you can get into with a button press, and in the credits, Hori is credited in there. So I don't know if they're just credited because of this SGB Commander controller, or if they actually had something to do with the development of the SGB itself.
Mhm.
But so for anybody who doesn't know what this is all about, basically the original Game Boy runs at a clock speed that is I forget exactly what it is. It's 4 mega. It's a little bit over 4 megabytes or megabytes, a little over 4 megahertz, and
I'll
it's a
get the
power of
exact
two.
numbers, but you keep
It's a
going.
power of two, like yeah. So if you do 2 to the power of whatever until you get to 4 million, then that'll be your number. And so that's a pretty standard clock speed. You can get those clock crystals anywhere. But for the Super Game Boy, they have an I/O chip that does the translation between the controller from the Super NES, as well as transferring the video data to the Super NES, and it runs at 5 times the speed of the Game Boy. So it needs a much faster clock, which it then divides by 5 in order to pass off to the Game Boy CPU.
Hmm. And I just found on the site, retrorgb.com/Super Game Boy. Game Boy systems run at a clock speed of 4.194 megahertz. Technically, it's like 4.194.304, and the Super Game Boy runs at 4.295454. So it's actually, when you're talking about clock speeds, that's quite a difference.
Hmm.
And I believe the Super Game Boy 2 runs at the original clock speed of 4.194. So it is the same exact speed as the original.
Yep. And so the issue is that that 5x speed that they need for that I/O chip is not a standard speed, because it's not that power of 2. It's a power of 2 and then it's times 5,
Mm-hmm.
which is just kind of a weird number basically. So they looked at it and they said, okay, this is pretty close to the Super NES's system clock. Instead of, I think it's 20.9, 20.9 or something like that is the 5x speed it's supposed to be. We have 21.4. And they're like, oh, that's close enough. We'll just use that instead of making a custom crystal. And it worked. It just ran too fast. And depending on whether you've got a NTSC or a PAL version, it ran at 2 completely different speeds, because they also have 2 different speeds depending on if you're NTSC or PAL. So these earlier, so one other cool thing about that I/O chip is because it receives in a fast clock and then divides it down, it actually has the ability to speed up or slow down the clock that it sends to the Game Boy CPU. So you can play the Super Game Boy games in slow motion, or you can fast forward them, and that's a feature that the SGB Commander controller implements, because it actually sends the command to say do the fast forward, do the slowdown, and without that controller, you can't do that. So a lot of people don't even know that that's something that exists. So the problem with these other clock mods that lift the pins and wire it in, that actually breaks the SGB Commander, because now the I/O chip is no longer sending a clock signal to the CPU. You're giving it its own clock that's completely separate.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked into it and I was like, these other mods, they're ugly, but it's a really simple thing to do if you can get your hands on the right crystal to send it, which that was difficult because, like I said, it's not a standard one. It's not one that you can just go out and buy.
So how did you find it?
So I was able to find, so what I ended up using was a PLL, which is a chip that is able to take a clock signal and multiply it. Clock dividing is really easy. Clock multiplying is actually pretty complex, but there are chips that will just do it. It turns out that the original 4.1 megahertz clock is actually too slow for almost all of the PLLs that I was looking into. So that, I thought I hit a wall and I was like, oh, well, it was a good idea, but it's just not going to work. But then I found one place that sold a clock crystal that was 2 times the original speed. So it was that power of 2 times 2. And then I found a PLL that'll do 2.5 times, and you put the 2 together, and now you've got your 5x that you needed. And then for making the PCB to actually wire it all up, I was actually inspired by one of Bordy's boards. It was his SD to SNES op-amp mod for the MSU1 audio for the old versions.
Right, yeah.
His board did something that I'd never seen before. Like I knew that PCB edge castellations were a thing, where you have the little plated half holes on the edge of the board, and you can use that to solder to pads on a surface mount board. But I had never, for whatever reason, I only thought of that in like rectangular boards, and you put them on the edge. I had never thought to build a weird irregular shaped board to place those castellations over components on an existing board. And so when he did that, it just kind of like clicked in my head that this was something that I could do. And so I used that idea to build the Super Game Boy clock mod in a way that was really easy to install.
That's awesome. I love stuff like that. I love creative out of the box ways of solving problems that, before. Yeah, I don't want to add anything to this video because I certainly don't want to put any negativity, but just Google some of the old clock mods, and they're equal to, if not worse than, the old ROM hacks that you used to have, the repros, because while it's the same ball of wires and sometimes just like somebody snotted a thing of hot glue all over it, you also have to remember whenever you're doing clock wires around a board, there's so much that can go wrong with that. I'll try to skip to the end and not nerd out for 10 minutes just on wire routing, but it's very bad if you run those clock wires in the wrong place, or too long, something like that.
Yeah, and too long is actually a big deal when you're dealing with clocks in particular, because you don't think about it, but a wire acts like a capacitor, and putting a capacitor on there actually changes the speed of the crystal, which unfortunately is something that I actually just discovered this past week was happening with my mod boards. Yeah, so my mod boards, I just built a really cool test rig so that I can actually test the final things and view the output speeds out to 6 significant figures now. Before I was only able to do out to 4. And I discovered that because I picked a particular capacitor instead of a different capacitor, I was out by, at the 5th decimal place, I had an error that was just slightly out of what I was aiming for in terms of the accuracy. So for anybody who has purchased a board before now, I'm trying to get a hold of them and tell them the value of capacitor that they can swap out. It only makes it makes a difference of 1 frame every 2.5 minutes. So it's about on the same order of magnitude as, say, like the Super NT 0 lag mode.
Okay, so that's it's not a huge.
It's not anything that's perceptible. It would only really make a difference if you were a speedrunner that was at like a high level where half a second over the course of 2 hours was actually going to make a difference in a run.
Yeah.
So I'm not too worried about it.
So I love making sure. I guess there's 2 comments I have about that. First of all, I love making sure things are always in place for speedrunners, because that accomplishes 2 things. Now you're helping out a very fun and exciting hobby. I do like watching some of the speedruns, especially when like some of those YouTube channels cuts it down to a nice 10-minute video that you can watch and enjoy. But that's cool that we get to help those groups of people, but it also helps preserve the originality of the whole experience, because it's so easy to get lost in enhancements, which I love. I have no problem with that, but there always should be a nod to the original experience, even if you don't think it might matter. At some point it might. So I love that. I love that people like you are jumping through the hoops to do that. And also, you're making me smile when you're talking about these problems, because I guess you could describe me as an expert in nothing, but I know a little bit about a lot of stuff, which is kind of what my job's always had to be, throughout life, and even now with RetroRGB. And I can't tell you how many times I've run into stuff where it's like, but I did everything right. Everything's exactly the way it's supposed to be. And then it's usually Steve from HD Retrovision will just shake his head at me like, like a disapproving grandfather, like, but you forgot about the resistance of the wires. Like, no! So yeah, that's a funny story just because of all the different points it hits. But that's now available on Tindy still, right?
Yep.
That board. And what do you think the skill level for installation would be for somebody for that?
So the installation skill level on that is very low. That one's very simple, very easy to install.
So if you could do something like a Super Nintendo RGB mod, you could probably pull this off as well.
I think so, yeah. Okay. You have to remove 3 surface mount. I hope I didn't lose anything. My screen's blanked out. Okay. So you have to remove 3 surface mount components.
Right, and do you need to save those components and reuse them, or do you just need to remove them? So that's pretty easy. And in fact, just like a quick soldering tip, I have that Kesker gun that Voltar did the video on that I can't stop raving about this thing. It makes my skill level back to like, what it should be for somebody who's been soldering as long as I have. And I love the wedge tip, and I just place the wedge tip right on the side of the component and then just kind of wiggle it off. But very often, that component goes shooting across my desk and I never see it again. All right, let me put this back. But so, yeah.
The other thing you can do that helps a lot is you can just take some new solder wire and you just kind of flood the solder onto it until you've got enough to just kind of short across both terminals. and then that makes it really easy to heat both up at the same time. And then you just kind of wipe the thing off. Make sure you don't have a short on the pads after you leave them.
Yeah,
But,
true. So.
But yeah, so you just have to you remove 3 components, and then you solder down four little surface mount points that all should line up properly with the board, and then you should be good to go.
Sounds.
I have another board that adds the link port, because that's another thing that the Super Game Boy had that the original didn't, was the link port.
The Super Game Boy 2, the Japanese version had.
Right, the Super Game Boy 2 had it that the original didn't. And I think part of that is because of the clock speed issue, because I don't think, I haven't actually tried it, but I think you would get desyncs, basically, if you had 2 consoles running at different speeds and trying to do the link port between them. So I have the link port mod, and that one requires a bit more skill, because that you actually do have to solder to the pins on the CPU. But I have created a flex PCB adapter that hopefully should make that a lot easier.
Oh, cool.
That basically lays down on top of the pins, and you just solder it across all of the pins all at once. And then it just breaks out the ones that you need into 6 little parallel pads that you can actually solder together with just a ribbon wire like this, that it's spaced out,
so it's kind of like Bordy's adapter for the N64.
Yeah, it's a lot like that.
It's awesome to see people getting into flex cable technology these days, whereas 5-6 years ago this was unheard of. You'd never see anybody do that.
The fact that Oshpark started offering flex is huge. The fact that I can go and just order 3 of them and get them at a reasonable price without. Right now, the one issue that I have with Oshpark on their Flex is that I think they don't get very many orders of it yet, because it's still really new, and so it takes them a long time to fill up a panel. And the last, based on the 2 times that I've ordered, or maybe 3, it's taken about a month turnaround for that. But
the price is still wildly different than a lot of other places would have been.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I was finding places that were quoting me $12 per board at a quantity of like 500. Like at a quantity of 500, you should be, for a little adapter that's like that big, it shouldn't be anywhere close to that.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So I don't know if maybe I checked the wrong boxes on the like quote form of these are the features that I need, because there's it's a full page with 30 different check boxes and drop downs, and so maybe I checked the wrong box. But yeah, the prices were crazy. So
I wish OSH Park had some kind of better way to say, like, the minimum order's 3, but hey, based on the size and shape of your design, if you order 7, we could do that on 1 panel. So or maybe 20, whatever the number might be. But there's been many times that I ordered from them that it took about a month. I have these adapter boards coming that I ordered 3 weeks ago that still aren't here yet, that if I ordered from JCL PCB, they would have been there 4 days after I placed the order, even though they're in China. And it's like, it drives me nuts sometimes, but I wish they just had something like, hey, just here's the minimum you can get to be on one thing, and we'll get it out within 2 days. That would make my life a lot easier. That's one of the many reasons I don't use them anymore.
Yeah, well, I use them for some things. Like, basically for me, the big deal is size. I build a lot of stuff that's like this size. This is actually one of the link port mods, and stuff this size is great at Oshpark because they have really cheap prices at about this size, and they do the gold plating. They support edge castellations. Both of those, if you try and get either of those anywhere else, they immediately shoot your price way up. But those are just built in at Oshpark. Probably about the time you get to something like, say, an Arduino Shield size, that's roughly the point where it's going to start getting more expensive at Oshpark than if you were to go somewhere else. But when you're prototyping for stuff like this, they're great. And I haven't had nearly as much lead time on normal boards as you seem to have had. It's
Mhm.
definitely a couple of weeks, but it might help that I'm on the West Coast and they're shipping from Portland, so it's
Oh,
just
good point.
it's so it's only like 2 or 3 days shipping with the free shipping option.
Yeah, I try to pay attention to which places to go for what needs, but this last board I did was twice the size of yours. So the one you just
Hmm.
held up, not very big, and it's, we're pushing a month now. Whereas I just got the latest triple bypass prototypes in for version 2, and I think I placed the order on like a Tuesday afternoon, and they arrived on Friday or something like that from JCL PCB. But no castellations, nothing crazy, just a very basic board, 2-layer board or something like that. So it's once you start to get to the craziness, I imagine uh, OSH Park would probably have a much better, a better tool to use. I guess is the better way to describe
Yeah,
it. So.
and I've used I use JLC PCB for my production runs. Uh, just one thing that was a real big deal for a production run is the fact that all of your boards come properly routed on all sides, so you don't get the little mouse bite tabs on all the sides, which is not a problem for when you're building your prototypes and you only have a few of them. But having to like file off the edges and smooth them down on 100 boards is not something I want to do. And
Well, but your boards might require that because they have to be perfectly placed. Whereas if you have something like the triple bypass, it could be burred all the way around. It doesn't make a slightest bit of a difference.
well, it's not so much the perfect placement on that. I'm doing all of my own assembly, and so I do solder stencils, and I need to be able to fit it into the little the
Oh,
stencil jig,
right.
and so I take the stencil jig and I tape it down to my desk, and based on the actual PCB size, and then if I have burrs coming off the edge, it just won't fit into the jig.
Right, I didn't think of that. I didn't think of that at all. In fact, if Jose is listening to this, he's probably swearing at YouTube right now, like, "Yeah, it doesn't affect you, Bob. It affects me when I'm trying to build them all." All right, good point. I stand corrected.
Yeah. But
So
that's
what?
that's not an issue when you're doing three of them,
Right,
but it is an issue if you're trying to build 50 or 100.
absolutely. I mean, so your Tindy page, you have a few things up on there, right? What else have you been selling?
Right now I don't have very much. Right now I've got the Super Game Boy mods, the clock mod, and uh, the clock mod and the link port mod, and then I have Mr. IO boards just because I bought the PCBs to build my own,
Hmm.
and I'm just kind of selling off the rest. I'm populating and selling off the rest of those. I'm not really looking to get into selling Mr. accessories, but I had to buy 10 of them to get the price that I wanted for the boards, so I'm trying to sell the rest of those. I have a couple of other mods that are in, various stages of development that I will eventually try and get up there. Um, but right now, the really helpful thing though is that because the Super Game Boy Clock mod has kind of taken off and
Hmm.
I've started to sell a lot of those, it's given me the ability to have some money up front to finally invest in some of these other projects. Where
Hmm.
some of these other projects, it costs 20 or $30 per prototype between the board and all of the parts and stuff. And
Oh,
when
I
I'm
know that
just doing it
feeling
out of
all
pocket,
too well.
yeah, and when I'm doing it just out of my own pocket, I get it to that point where it's like 80% of the way there. It works. I have a whole bunch of bodge wires hacked on. I have it installed in my own console, and I'm like, it works. So I'm just going to use it. Um, and also, some of these, in the past, I have just been building them for myself because before the SGB clock mod, I really hadn't sold anything. I'd sold maybe like the SGB clock mod, for example, before I posted it on Tindy. It really has been a matter of knowing where to go to sell stuff, because before all I was doing was like posting on forums or on Discord and stuff and being like, hey, I've got this thing, I made it, if anybody's interested. And I think I sold like two of them in 6 months.
Yeah,
And
eBay is my worst nightmare and one of the greatest selling tools, both at the same time. The eBay
mhm.
treats sellers like garbage, and I get it. They're trying to prevent scammers, but then there's things like the the wording of your auctions. So if you put mod in your auctions, so if you sold a T-shirt that said Bob's Console Mod T-shirt, you might get flagged for something like that. It's just the rules are insane. So I understand why people wouldn't want to do that anymore. And I guess Tindy's probably a great place to sell your stuff because I don't think they're as harsh about that.
That and they're it's like Etsy for electronics. So it's just full of people that, are into this kind of stuff that kind of know what they're getting into, where it's kind of hard on eBay to differentiate, hey, I'm doing good quality work, where on eBay you can find like repro carts all over the place, and they're probably that same spaghetti wire crap you were seeing 5 years ago. Yeah. Or maybe they're just buying the super stackers just because it's easier. But it's hard to be like, hey, I made this clock mod, and it's not like the other ones that you're seeing where you got to lift up the pins. This is easier. It works better. It's cleaner. It's hard to convey that on eBay auctions. On eBay, what you tend to find is you find buyers who want to buy something at the lowest possible price.
Right. Or just people that innocently don't know any better, and eBay seems like a good place to start. So yeah. I have such mixed feelings about that. There's so many people too that are selling retro junk that use pictures from my site and then word it as if I was the seller, because they don't say it's from RetroRGB, but they'll like put links to the SNES mod, and they'll have
we did RetroRGB's mod.
Yeah, something like that. It drives me insane. Yeah. I try to ignore it because it just pisses me off, but there were a few times where I told people to please take all of my stuff off of there because they're terrible. And they get very upset, but it's not my problem. It's just whatever.
Yeah. So probably the next mod that I'd really like to get into a finished and sellable state is I've got this board right here. I don't know if my camera will focus.
No, that's perfect. Yep.
Okay. So this is an add-on board for the NES RGB that does a handful of stuff. It does the component video conversion.
Okay.
But then it also outputs it for the Wii multi-out, the pinout. Because I've seen a lot of people who are doing the adding SNES style multi-outs to their NESs. And I wanted to do the Wii multi-out because it actually supports component video on the default pinout. But it does something a little weird where it actually multiplexes 3 of the output pins. In NTSC regions, you had S-video and component. And depending on which cable you plugged in, it would detect which cable you plugged in, and it would put that signal on those pins. So if you plug in a component video cable, it would give you component. If you plugged in an S-video cable, you'd get S-video.
Right.
In PAL regions, it was RGB and component. So this includes the switching detection, the cable detection and the switching for that, as well as a stereo mixing for people who want to do the stereo mods.
So how do you handle that? Because that was one of the first mods I looked into before the site was even a website, when it was still just a Google Doc I was writing. And I was never able to get it perfect if you add in... Oh, geez. Sorry, can you hear that crap out there?
Yeah.
If you add in the Famicom expansion audio, that was always the problem I had.
That's something I haven't figured out yet either. So that's one of the things I need to figure out if I'm going to try and do this. But
because a while back, what I was told is that if you just take the NES 2 audio channels and you run them through 2 pots or 1 pot or something, and you could... I always really like it at like 15 to 20% separated, sometimes all the way up to 50 depending on the game. But I feel like it gives it a fake depth when you're listening to it. Some people hate it, but whatever. So
yeah, I don't like the full separation either. So that's what I have on here. You can see those 2 pots right there.
Exactly. Perfect.
The actual those are the mixing pots so that you can mix the mono back into it and only get some slight separation.
The only problem I had with that was no matter how I tried to factor in the Famicom expansion audio, it never really worked right. It would always set the level. I mean, it's like adding resistance to something that you're changing the resistance with a pot. So it's changing everything. And one person I spoke to who was way more knowledgeable than I am said that the best way to accomplish that would be to put all three through a mini digital amplifier and then manipulate it that way, either on the output side or find an amp that could do that. So I never went farther than that because I didn't have enough time, and because the high def Nest does that built into itself. A lot of the other stuff out there, I think the Mister can mess with that stuff now. So, but I'm still really hoping that somebody solves that for all versions of the Nest and Famicom, just because it's such a neat thing. In my opinion, people hate it with a passion, but just a little bit of separation, I just think it adds some very cool effects if you're listening through a stereo.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that, like, this board works. Like, I could sell this. The problem is that there's that issue with I haven't accounted for the Famicom expansion audio, and the other thing that I want to account for is I just so the component video conversion circuit is something that you can find a lot of really like cheap and easy circuits online that'll do it, and you can just follow the diagram. But I want to like be able to confirm that I've done it properly. I don't just want to sell something that's like, hey, it does it. You can plug it in. If you've gone to the expense of buying an NES RGB, you're wanting the colors to come out right. That's kind of like the whole point. So
doesn't Tim have a circuit that he offers for that as well?
He does. It just makes it a little. If I'm actually using the same pins, you can see the right angle pins right here. I'm using those same pins that he mounts to in order to do my board. So this is replacing that.
Okay.
So you won't need his board and mine. This will incorporate all of that. Oh, the other thing that this board does is, let me see if I got it. Oh yeah. So on the multi-out connector, I also have, this is my pallet switch.
Okay, it's a little out of focus. Pull it back a tiny bit.
Okay.
There.
See if I can get it in.
It's almost. You have I think the Skype blur your background on or something, so it's sometimes it's perfect
probably.
and sometimes it isn't. There you go. Hold it right there.
Okay. So it's just a momentary push button, and you push the button to switch pallets.
Oh,
and then if you hold the button for a second, it'll save it so that the next time you power it on, it'll come back to the same one.
That is cool.
So rather than having one of those big, three-way toggle switches or a slide switch or something like that, you can just do it with one of those little momentary push buttons. So anyway, I actually just lucked out a week or two ago, and I got my hands on a Fluke a Fluke video signal generator.
Oh, cool.
That does like reference quality TV signal generation.
Mm-hmm.
And it can do all of the different test patterns. It can do the checkerboards. It does the color bars. It does the plugge. It does all the stuff you would need for TV broadcast. It even modulates it to the broadcast. You can tune it to a channel.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll even modulate it to the FM channel.
That's neat.
Yeah, but I don't need that. What I'm able to use it for though is it outputs RGB and component video, so I can output the reference quality RGB test signal. Then I can run it through my component video encoder, measure my component video output, and then compare it to their reference quality component video output. And I can do that with all their different signals and all kinds of different stuff, and be able to actually verify that I am outputting the right signal.
Yeah, that's that's something that on the Retro Roundtable we've talked a lot about, is the conversion between RGB and component, and that's way over my head. I would never even attempt anything like that. So I'm glad somebody's working on it, trying to get it perfect.
Yeah, that was the big showstopper for me. Like I'm happy with the quality as it is, but I can see that some of the colors aren't right at the moment. So I know my target audience for something like this, and my target audience for something like this is the kind of people who would buy it, see the problem, and just kind of tear it to shreds on that account. So I want to make sure that if I'm selling something like this, that I get it right.
That's awesome.
So hopefully we'll see something. I'm still taking classes at the moment, so hopefully in the next couple of months, once classes get out, I'll have some more time to play around with that, and maybe we'll see that in the next couple of months.
Awesome. Have you been doing any more MSU1 work or anything like that?
Some. I ported my Link to the Past MSU1 code over to the Link to the Past randomizer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's incorporated into the randomizer. I'm still working on Chrono Trigger. That's my big project that it'll be like a huge weight off my shoulder to finally finish that one of these days. But every time I feel like I'm getting close, I realize that there's something I could do better. I think I've completely thrown out and rewritten the assembly code like 4 different times now.
I think the last time I talked to you, you said you were just finishing Chrono Trigger too. So.
Oh yeah, like I really haven't done very much with it since the last video, partially because it's such a long game that when I have to play test it,
right?
I think I played through it like 3 or 4 times back to back, and I just got so burned out that I was just like, I love this game and I'm starting to hate it, and I don't want to hate this game because it's so good.
Yeah.
So I just had to step away from it, and it's a big enough project that before I can get back to it, I have to know that I can actually dedicate some time to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have to like fully refamiliarize myself with code that I haven't touched in a couple of years, and find all of my files, and yeah, like I need to know that I can sit down and really work on it before I even try to start. So
now, if I remember correctly, that was using a soundtrack that's not out for free, that you have to pay for, right?
There is a free one available as well, but yes, the primary one that I'm using is by a guy named Blake Robinson, who sells the soundtrack, which unfortunately right now he no longer sells it on Louder, which was the original source. He only sells it on iTunes, and iTunes does not support the FLAC format, which is what all of my scripts were targeted towards. Okay. And so that's another thing that I'll need to do at some point before calling it, done. I probably am going to have to buy the albums on iTunes, get the WAV versions, and then because they do offer a high quality WAV file is probably the one that I'll have to use. They offer their own ALAC format, but that's not something that I can decode with my tools.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll have to get the WAV version, and then hopefully the WAV version just matches up directly to the FLAC. But it might not. It might be at a different sampling rate. It might be slightly trimmed at the start or the end, and all of my trim points might be off because all of my scripts are down to the exact sample number. So all of these things could.
So that's something
I might have to redo it all.
Yeah, that's something I'd like to ask you about then. So I guess let me finish this conversation first, though. So the goal would be then that people could buy this album and then drag and drop the folder into something, or run a command line that just says star.star or whatever, something very basic that automatically converts this to the format needed. So the people who bought the album don't really need to do any more work other than run a script, and then it's just in the format needed and you put it in the folder. So, since the last time we spoke, I had tried to mess with a couple of MSU1 hacks, and I think I emailed you about one twice and completely forgot that I emailed you the first time, but I've never been able to get them to work right. I've never got the conversion tools to work, and I'm 100% positive it's something that I'm doing wrong. And is there an easier way or an easier set of tools that you could suggest people go to? And I think the easiest way for anybody to start would be to obviously take an MSU1 hack that's already completed, and then just go through and make your own audio files and just rename them to whatever the name was for that hack. So that way you're bouncing off somebody else's work. Somebody else has already hacked the ROMs and mapped it, and then you're just creating audio files for it. So is there a way? Like, is there a start, I think, for that?
Yeah. For just the audio files themselves, I actually have built my own tool. I don't know if I had done it at the time we did the last interview, but I have a tool called MSU PCM++. It's available on GitHub. And it has a bit of a steep learning curve because it's entirely command line based through a config file. So you don't have to do a ton of like long command line flags and all of that stuff.
You just have to edit the config file every time you
edit the config file. But the big thing is that it takes a bit of a paradigm shift for most people. Would start digging into things like they'd open up their file in Audacity and start editing. And and the thing with that is that if you go through that process, and let's say you like trim the file and then you apply a filter and then you change the volume level and you do all these things, and then you realize that you really didn't want to do what you did back in step number 2, you have to undo all the way back to that step and then redo everything after it.
Oh, okay.
Because every step actually changes the file.
Is there some kind of script that could be made for Audacity where you just drop in any file and it spits out what's needed for MSU1?
Maybe, but I went another direction with it. And basically that's what my tool does, is you create this config file and you say, okay, here, I want you to cut the file here. This is the end of the file. Here's where the loop point is. Here's the volume level I want. I want some fade in. I want some fade out. I want to do a crossfade on the loop because the loop point isn't quite seamless. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can do to it. You can change the tempo. You can, I don't even remember. You can combine multiple files. Either you can concatenate the files, so you have one file and then another file, or you can take 2 files and mix them together at the same time. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. And then the idea is that I still use Audacity when I'm creating them, but all I use it for is finding the sample number. Like I say, like, here's the loop point that I want. Now I'll go write that down in the config file. And the idea is that you should never actually modify your input file. You should be able to put it all in the config file and run it against the original input file that you first downloaded, and it just does everything and spits out the output, which then allows you to share that config file, and anybody who downloads that same input file can run the script and get the same output file.
Okay, hearing you explain it like that makes a lot more sense as to why it's set up that way. So adding things,
and then if you want, like, while you're working on it, if you want to make any changes, you're like, oh, I want to fade in longer, I want to fade in shorter or whatever, you can just tweak the numbers and rerun it, and it starts from scratch from that original input file and redoes all of the steps. So you don't lose anything at any point. You don't have to remember whether or not you need to undo a whole bunch of stuff. It just starts from the clean file every time as you're working. So it's really helpful while you're building them, as well as then giving you the ability to share your end result for things, especially like this Chrono Trigger thing, where if I download the input files from iTunes, if I download the WAV files, I could tell you to download those same WAV files from iTunes. You would get the same files, and all I would have to give you is this script, and then it would run, or this config file, and it would give you basically the same output file.
Okay.
It does apply a slight random dither effect to it, which does cause some randomness, so you wouldn't get bit perfect outputs. You could disable that if you wanted to, but essentially you would get the exact same output result.
You know, if I ever have free time again, I'll go back and see, because the easier of the 2 projects I wanted is porting Grant Henry Stemage, his Metroid Metal for Super Metroid. I wanted to use the original.
I actually already did that.
Did you?
I actually already did. Yeah.
Man!
I'll send you a link. Yeah.
Oh, please do. I'm so excited. And please, if you post it, tag Stemage, because he was freaking thrilled about that. I might even send him an SD to SNES.
I did I did on Twitter when I posted it. I don't remember. I'm pretty sure I tagged him on Twitter when I posted it. But yeah, I had to use a couple of other sources because I couldn't find a couple of the tracks. He hasn't, at some of the like ambiance tracks he hasn't done. I think I used. Have you heard of Dwayne and Brando?
No.
Well, they did an album. I didn't use the one from their album. I think Brando went off and did his own solo album, and that was what I actually ended up using. But yeah, they do like like kind of off color parody tracks of
Okay.
a lot of video game music and stuff. They have an album. It's called the LP of Destruction, I think.
I just
Yeah.
wrote that down so I can go and look it up afterwards. Well, that's
Yeah.
awesome. That's pretty cool stuff. The only other thing I wanted to do is somebody, I'm forgetting the name, but one developer used whatever tools are out there to hack Super Metroid, but they did the exact maps as original Metroid. So not Zero Mission, none of
Oh,
the
that's
extra
cool.
stuff, but it
Hmm.
was, I mean, it was great. The only two problems with it is one weird thing where they used the same icon for two things, and the it saves automatically. So like if you die in Norfair, when you turn it off and back on again, where you first entered Norfair, it auto saved. I thought that was a brilliant way around it because obviously the original Metroid doesn't have saves. The only
Hmm.
bug is the same bug as all of the Metroid hacks, where the map it doesn't remember what screens that you've been to. So like you have to like I would as I'm playing through the game before I shut it off for the night. Actually, before I left any section, I would take like a cell phone picture of the screen to know which rooms I was in. Has that been fixed
I
yet,
might
by the way?
I might have to look into that. I hadn't heard of that particular Metroid hack before, but that sounds really interesting. And that map problem that you're describing is actually a problem that I fixed in the Super Metroid Link to the Past combo randomizer. So
Really?
I'm fairly familiar with that particular code, and I might have to go take a look at that.
So there's two major problems. The one problem is the person who made it doesn't respond to anybody. So that's sad because I really, I would love to help promote the work and get it out there.
Where did you find it in terms of
I
not
will
just where to get the
find you
patch,
the,
but
I'll find you the
like
link.
if it's a forum or something like
It
that,
was a
then
forum,
that
yeah.
okay.
But the music stinks. And I think the
Hmm.
developer themselves just said, hey, I just did what I could. I concentrated on the game. I wanted so badly to take because there's some really high quality rips of the Famicom Metroid soundtrack. I really
Hmm.
wanted the Famicom as an MSU file on that. I think that would have been the utmost, the perfect way to experience that game. The reimagining of the original, and a lot of weird little things are in it. Like you can't shoot diagonally, just like the original Metroid. So it's essentially like you're playing the original Metroid, but with the Super Metroid graphics, and
And
the control
physics. Did
and the
they mess with the
physics.
physics?
They did,
Okay.
but it was fair. So
Okay.
you couldn't play it as if you were playing Super Metroid, but it wasn't as clunky as the original. And sometimes people get
That's
really
good.
pissed when I say
Yeah.
that. It's
The,
groundbreaking
the
game,
original
but it's clunky.
Yeah, the movement mechanics are probably one of the biggest reasons why I've never finished the original Metroid. It's so slow and hard to jump onto platforms and stuff. And
Oh yeah, try to
it,
play
yeah.
Kraid on the original when you're used to all the other 2D versions of it. It's
Mm.
yeah. I have to. I will absolutely send you that as soon as we're done because that was one that struck me so hard when I played that because I was just this was the first time anybody's ever really done that, and there was a few like zero something mission. I'll bring up the
Mhm.
page.
Super Zero Mission. I've played at least one version of that. I know they've put out a bunch of versions with
Really,
changes over time.
I liked it. It wasn't the same map though. It was inspired
Mm.
by and
Yeah.
some parts were unnecessarily hard, I guess.
I
Um,
have never finished it because there was one particular Shine Spark that I could not. I couldn't do it after you beat Mother Brain. There's a Shine Spark that I cannot pull off, and I need to go back and check if they've like put out an update or something and changed that particular spot. But
yeah, so
yeah.
I played that 5 years ago, 4 years ago, or something. I'm just on the page now. It's just RetroRGB / Super Metroid ROM hacks, and that was one of my notes in Super Zero Mission. And I remember when I played it, I remember taking the save file, moving that to an emulator, using save states to
Mhm.
beat it. Like it's cheating, but it's I still played it. I didn't like use a Game Genie hack and cheat through it, but I definitely
Mhm.
used save states. And still cheated. and then moved that save file back to the SD to SNES and continue the game. But there were two specific parts of the game that I thought were absolutely ridiculous and clearly designed by people that were only using emulation and save states in order to play the game, which is cool, but I predominantly, original hardware for these things. But yeah, it was called Retroid, and it was on metroidconstruction.com, and when I just clicked on the link now, even though this used to be a page, it said that hack has been rejected. Sorry. So I don't know what happened to it. But I'll send you the ROM, and hopefully we can figure out who came up with it, because if you could have that with the map fixed and the Famicom version of the Metroid soundtrack on there, I think that would be people's go-to. And heck, who knows what else people could do. Maybe you can get Vitor in there to hack in some SA1 animation just for the hell of it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you as always for doing these things. Hopefully I'll do your voice justice this time and not screw it up in post. But I will leave links to your Tindy page, to your Twitter account. And is there any other ways that, any other places people could follow your work?
I do have a Discord server, so I could send you a link to that.
Please do.
And mostly, I'm active on things like the retro gaming server as well. And Smoke Monsters server. But if people are just wanting to get a hold of me, especially if you have any troubleshooting issues with any of my mods and you just need to ask me questions or whatever, probably my Discord server would be the easiest place to do that.
Cool. Well, thank you for all the work that you've done and given to the community over the years, all the free work. I'm glad that you're making a little bit of money off of the Super Game Boy stuff, so we could see what else that you could come up with. So I'm going to keep in touch whether you like it or not, and we'll probably do another one of these in, sometime in the future. So thanks again.
All right.